Hello, my name is John Cobourn. I'm a retired water resource specialist with University of Nevada, Reno Extension. I'm happy to be here. I want to thank Shane Fryer at the Carson River Coalition for putting together a 3-minute tutorial on how to create a PowerPoint video. So that's helped me, and I'm interested in participating in this Watershed Wednesday series. I'll be talking a little bit today about the Carson River Watershed, the history of floodplain management. It's particularly the recent history in the last about 25 years. And so let's get going and learn a little bit about where that came from. Also a little bit about where the Carson River Coalition came from. Well, first, let's take a look at this map. It shows actually the watershed areas, all the areas that contribute precipitation to both the Truckee River on the north side and to the Carson River watershed on the south side. So you have the Sierra Nevada in the lower left, the high country which gets the most of the precipitation in the form of snow, and both rivers flow generally towards the northeast. The Carson River doesn't have any large reservoirs in headwaters the way the Truckee River does. One of the biggest contrasts is that the Carson River watershed has less urbanization on its floodplains than the Truckee River to the north. So when a floodplain of a river is urbanized, the way Los Angeles is, and actually Reno and Sparks are on the floodplain of the Truckee River, and you can see in the upper right that the Truckee River through downtown is in a concrete box channel. That's kind of the choice that you make for your river, and the contrast here is even sharper if you look at the Carson River on the left, and then on the right, the lower picture is of the Los Angeles River, which used to flood the urbanized floodplain of Los Angeles for decades until the river was finally put into this immense concrete channel. And it's somewhat effective at reducing flooding in Los Angeles, but there's no habitat for fish or wildlife there. And the people of Los Angeles for decades have been wishing that they had their river back, and they've been attempting to install some habitat into that concrete channel. So that's an ongoing process. But the choice we have to make is, can we keep a properly functioning river like the Carson River without having to, and not urbanize its floodplain, so that we can keep it that way instead of needing to put it in a concrete channel? Well, let's look at one of the really large floods that affected our region back in 1997. This was January 1st, 1997. It's known as the New Year's flood. It was one of the biggest that we've had, although not necessarily the biggest. And it shows that contrast I've been talking about between the Carson Valley watershed, the Carson River watershed on the right, and the Truckee River watershed on the left. Reno and Sparks are so urbanized, the floodwaters were 5 feet deep in those downtown casinos with the slot machines. They were in water. And the cost of flood damages on the Truckee River watershed, because so much of their floodplain has been urbanized, the cost of those flood damages was 30 times higher for the Truckee River watershed than it was for the Carson River watershed. Well, in addition to the flooding issue, the Carson River watershed, like most watersheds, has a bunch of other issues that need to be looked at. In addition to the major river floods, there are the summer flash floods, which tend to occur in smaller rivers and alluvial fans. There's always, in many western rivers, including our watershed, there's development pressure, and particularly for development on agricultural lands and in lands near a river. There's water quality problems, very common, and they have to be looked at in terms of all these other issues, because everything's connected in a watershed. There's a lack of watershed storage on the Carson River watershed upstream. We also have fragmented habitat, and fisheries that in some places are not healthy in terms of the way they used to be. So looking at all these issues, people started thinking, and particularly after the flood, that it was time to maybe have a conference to start looking at integrated management. So early in 1997, people from many agencies started talking. Of course, everyone was talking about the big flood, but many of us were thinking, geez, we ought to really have better communication and better collaboration in this watershed, and started talking about a conference to try to accomplish that. I would say the 1997 flood was kind of a wake-up call, but people from many agencies got together to help plan it. There was folks from the state of Nevada, Bureau of Water Quality Planning, Division of Environmental Protection, folks from the conservation districts. There was folks from the U.S. Geological Survey, University of Nevada, Extension, and we started having meetings to create a conference that would be really with the goal of improving communication and collaboration in watershed management. Well, probably the main theme of that 1998 Watershed Conference was integrated watershed management. It was kind of a new term. And in a watershed like the Carson River Watershed, there are different agencies to deal with different issues. There's agencies to look at water quality, maybe a different agency to look at water quantity and water supply. Other agencies maybe look at flooding and or wildlife or fire management. Plus there's different jurisdictions. There's different counties and cities. So when anyone in any one of those agencies is trying to solve some kind of problem and they want to design a solution to that problem, they really should talk to the other folks so that fixing one problem in one place doesn't create a new problem somewhere else. We really want win-win. Well, the designers of that 1998 conference really thought it through and wanted to do something so that there would be action following this event. And actually, we had a second day of that conference in which we had invited people to look at the different things we could actually do, discuss all kinds of options, to look at all the different issues. And at the end of that day, we had a survey, or what we called it an opinionaire, and allowed people to express their opinion on what we should do. And 77% of those who filled out that opinionaire, they expressed the opinion they wanted to see they wanted us to form a citizens and interagency group to coordinate watershed management on the Carson River. Now, the Carson Water Subconservancy District was one of the agencies that helped plan the conference. And at the end of the conference second day, they were actually invited to be the agency to house or support a new citizens and interagency group. And this group, very soon after the conference, within a few months, this became the Carson River Coalition, the good old CRC. Well, now that we've looked at how the Carson River Coalition got started, let's get back to our main topic for today, which is flooding. Western Nevada gets very large floods, river floods, usually in the winter, about every 15 years on average. And these floods usually affect the Carson, the Truckee, and the Walker rivers. And the one in 1997 was one of the very big ones. Some of the other really big floods that occurred in western Nevada were huge floods in 1862, also big floods in 1890, 1907, 1938, 1950, 1955. So they're not. Sometimes you get floods that are 2 or 3 years apart, or 5 years apart, and other times it's over 20 years apart. In any case, the big ones do a lot of damage. And in the Carson River Watershed, 1997 did damage all the way down the river. Carson Valley, Carson City, Dayton, Lyon County. Looking at this map on the left, it shows the flood extent in the Carson Valley, and it shows that with 395 going up the center and then Foothill Road on the left, the actual extent of flooding was the entire 100-year floodplain and then some. So it's because the valley is so wide and flat, it made a lake about 10 miles long and 2 to 3 miles wide. Well, looking at the kind of damages and the kind of flooding that we can have in our Nevada rivers, it's interesting to look at the choices we have to make along our rivers. Building houses next to rivers is something that some people really want to do. They want to have that riverfront property, but it's a mistake to let people build their houses there. These photos, the top one was from down by Dayton, Lyon County, a house built right next to the river, and during the '97 flood, the house was destroyed. Rivers can move. Not only do rivers meander, and that can be a gradual progress. Channel migration can happen during a big flood, and the channel can move hundreds of feet because of the power of that huge force and power of that deep, fast water. And these houses were put really where the river needed to move. They shouldn't have been put there. They shouldn't allow development that close to rivers, even though most of the time they don't have that much flow in them. In the bottom photo, there's a home in St. George, Utah. Same thing. Channel migration ripped that house apart. So we need to learn and not continue making that mistake. Well, in the first 5 years of the Carson River Coalition, we were pretty busy working on water supply, water quality, uh, and best management practices, all sorts of things. And so Steve Lewis from our Gardnerville Cooperative Extension Office asked the group one day, what would, since we're doing so many different things, what would be, if we had one message for the public, what would that main message be? And the people in the group thought that made sense, and several of them joined Steve and helped put together a survey that we could administer to all the members of the CRC, even those who don't attend very often. And so they asked them, what's the main message? And the clear winner from that survey, which is a two-step process, it was well done. The clear message, the main message is protect the river floodplain from future development. And this one is rather important. I'm actually going to read this one. So the main message, protect the floodplain from future development. Once the floodplain, and especially the river's meander belt corridor, are impacted by development, the river loses its ability to reestablish its natural functions. Agricultural fields near the channel are critical for floodwater attenuation, groundwater recharge, non-point source pollution buffering, and for providing habitat for wildlife. This main message actually incorporated some of the guiding principles that the CRC came up with even earlier in the first couple years of its inception. So at this point, the Carson River Coalition had its work cut out for it. With that main message in mind, I want to just take a moment to mention that while we really emphasized river flooding in our main message, we also have, in addition to river floods, we do have alluvial fan floods or flash floods all around the Carson River watershed. These two diagrams, the one on the left, it shows a kind of an idealized cross section of a river valley flood. It's actually much exaggerated. The vertical is much exaggerated on this, and at that 100-year flood zone down in the lower part of the diagram is actually much wider in the Carson River watershed, for example, the Carson Valley. And that floodplain is best used for open space, agriculture, and recreation, not for permanent development. The the other diagram shows an alluvial fan where we have our flash floods, the canyon and the mountain range. If there's a very heavy thunderstorm up there in the summertime, the water can rush down that canyon and come on to the apex of an alluvial fan. And if there's homes or businesses on the alluvial fan, they can get damaged too. And we do have alluvial fan floods around the Carson watershed, in particular in the Carson Valley. Well, in around 2007, one of our CRC working groups, which is called the River Corridor Group, decided it was time to write a regional floodplain management plan for the watershed. And this was done with a lot of input from the community, and it basically the management plan, which we still have, endorses a living river approach to floodplain management, and that basically means respect the river. The floodplain is really part of the river, so definitely minimize development on the floodplain of the river. It also recommends a flood hazard outreach educational program, and many publications are produced by Extension and other agencies involved with the Carson River Coalition. The management plan also promotes economic benefits of natural low-cost flood protection. In other words, rather than putting in big levees, flood walls, dams, basins, try to just manage the floodplain so that we don't have homes in harm's way. So let's go into a little more detail about that natural low-cost flood protection recommended by the management plan. It's also called non-structural flood protection, because instead of building dams, levees, and flood walls, we're just keeping houses out of harm's way. Well, how do we do that? Most of the land along the river, particularly in our valleys in the Carson River watershed, it's privately owned. It's farmers and ranchers own it. And they have the right, they have property rights, so according to zoning, they might be able to develop some of it. So the strategy that works in many places is to purchase conservation easements in the floodplain. Now, the Carson City residents passed a quality of life initiative several years back, and they have an open space district in which they purchase lands, including ranches, and turn them into parks and open space. Douglas County had a ballot initiative in 2020 that was focused mostly on conservation easements. So a farmer or rancher could sell the development rights to Douglas County if this had passed, and they would continue farming it and owning it, but the next owner wouldn't be able to create business parks or subdivisions there. Well, that ballot initiative failed. I don't think enough people understood why a tax, a 1/4 cent sales tax, was needed. Another funding source is the Southern Nevada Public Lands Management Act, or SNPLMA, or SNPLMA, which is, it's tough to get funding from that. And there hasn't been that much success in the Carson watershed, but we need to keep trying, because farmers and ranchers, property owners, need to be compensated if they're not going to be able to turn riverfront property into subdivisions and business parks. And this is one way to do it, but the community needs to participate. We need more public education to create that political will. Well, here's one of the publicity pieces for the ballot initiative in Douglas County for an open space program. And it was called Question 3. It didn't pass. But a sales tax, it called for a sales tax of 1/4% on purchases, and that would have cost an average Douglas County family about $30 per year. So as it says here, the cost is low and the results are worth it. Um, Obviously, and I understand that of the people that cast ballots in Douglas County, about 3,000 of the people that cast ballots didn't even vote yes or no on question 3, which makes me think that somehow we didn't get the word out. They weren't educated enough about what the value of such a proposition would be. So it just makes me think, there's we need to keep working on educating the public about the value of open space in floodplains. Well, floodplains also provide beneficial functions to society. These are called ecosystem services, and we don't pay for them, but they produce a lot of value for our communities. And here's some examples. When floodwaters spread out on the floodplain, it reduces flood damages. We've already talked about that one. Healthy vegetation acts as a natural filter along the river, improving water quality. It also is the vegetation along rivers and creeks is riparian vegetation is very important for habitat for all kinds of birds and wildlife. Groundwater during floods, or I should say floodwater during floods will soak into the ground and down into groundwater, and that'll augment flow later in the year during dry periods. And of course, we've already talked about the main message. At our Carson River Watershed Conference in 1998, one of our speakers was Jeff Mount, the chairman of the geology department at UC Davis, and he has quite a sense of humor. He came up with the term the cycle of serial engineering, and it's kind of like the serial murder of a river, and it happens in stages. First, structures, meaning homes or businesses near a channel, are flooded by a big flood. The response is the community will build levees to protect those structures. Then more homes and businesses will be built because it's thought to be safe, but those new levees will fail because a bigger flood will come along. Then the government will channelize the river, straighten it out, and build larger levees, but the community is still not safe because a larger flood may come along and break those levees as well. And what it'll lead to, since there's lots of businesses and homes in the floodplain, is the river will be put into a concrete river channel. And once you have a river channel that's made out of concrete, you may think that you have flood protection, but you no longer have a living river. Well, we've now circled back to the question that I posed earlier in the presentation, and that's what future do we want for our river? And you have the Los Angeles River on the left, the Carson River on the right in these two photos. That river channel of the Los Angeles River is immense, and it does convey some flood protection, but there's no longer really fish or wildlife habitat in that river, whereas in the Carson River, the photo of the Carson River on the right, which is actually Washoe tribal land, there's good vegetation along that river, good habitat, and certainly an opportunity for even more restoration and improvement of habitat in the future. So that's what we're up against, is to decide what we're going to have. So this is the question our community has to answer. What's the future that we want and that we're going to be able to pay for the river? The benefits of floodplain protection occur slowly over time. It's very economical to prevent flood damages, and we avoid the future costs of those damages if we protect the floodplain now. There are quite a few publications, but here's a couple that have to do specifically with the Carson River. Cooperative Extension works with many people in the Carson River Coalition in 2014 and 15 to produce a publication called Floodplain Protection Inventory, where we found that somewhere around a quarter or a third of the floodplain and various parts of the watershed are already protected by either public ownership or conservation easement, but that's still a very small percentage. And then agriculture is a good fit in floodplains. These are available online and also through the Carson Water Subconservancy District. I want to thank everybody. It's been a fantastic experience working with all of you in these Watershed Wednesdays.